What's up, you guys? Adam here with Anabolic Climbing, and today it's time for the review of the Handmaxxing protocol. So if some of you guys know, I was running growth hormone for the better part of the last 4 months with the goal of increasing collagen synthesis, finger strength, and overall durability to the majority of my physique and skeleton. Did it work? Did my hands grow? Was my hypothesis correct? Well, if you guys like these kind of experiments for yourselves in the climbing community, please hit that like, subscribe, and alert bell. Helps the channel out tremendously. Drop a comment, join the Discord, and yeah, let's jump into it. So, first off, I want to go through some of the mechanisms around growth hormone because I think that some of the climbing community misunderstands some of it. In general, we're really concerned with type 1 and type 3 collagen synthesis, but there's a lot of different ways for us to get there. And one of the most effective ways to do that is through growth hormone. Obviously, growth hormone increases IGF-1, which then downstream has the ability of upregulating type 1 and type 3 collagen synthesis. But it does more than that. It's not just limited to being a tendon wonder tool. And yes, while it does increase tendons to super physiological sizes as well as keeping the overall lattice structure in place, it also has similar effects to soft tissue as well that I want to touch on. Because when I've made other videos in the past about how to grow your hands as an off-width climber, it does have downstream impacts to, for example, soft tissue growth by increasing fibroblast proliferation as well as fluid retention, porosteel apoptosis, and new bone deposited in the outer cortex. More importantly, cartilage remodeling. This is both good for knees as well as for fingers as well. And obviously an increase in fluid retention, which is going to be impacted most notably in the ankles and in the fingers. So, how do we begin to think about this? Yes, is this the growth hormone doing all of this directly? No, a lot of this is downstream from IGF-1. Additionally, this isn't the only mechanism to upregulate IGF-1. For example, you could exogenously take IGF-1 LR3 or Increlex, which you don't have the budget for Increlex. Number two, you could also leverage things like androgens, which downstream will increase IGF-1 as well. Also, keep in mind that having crushed estradiol or E2 is one of the things that's going to limit your growth hormone expression. You need to have adequate levels of estradiol in order to get the maximum amount of IGF-1 out of your growth hormone, and it's also protective for collagen synthesis as well. Skin protection, it's neuroprotective. E2 is awesome as long as you're not dealing with too much and getting side effects like gyno. And lastly, a lot of folks tend to major in the minor when it comes to growth hormone dosing. They think to themselves, should I take it pre-workout? Should I take it post-workout? A bolus dose before bed is more than enough. While yes, your growth hormone is going to be pulsatile, peaking when you're asleep for a couple of hours, the IGF-1, which is going to be doing most of the heavy lifting, is going to be elevated regardless of when you end up taking your growth hormone. So don't worry about it. Pin it at night. Don't think twice about it. And while I do know guys that are experimenting with taking multiple doses of GH multiple times a day in reference to like hand training, I'm like, that's a thing you could do. Or you could just pin once at night, which is easier. Also, I don't really know, because we don't have enough data yet from climbers, whether or not running it multiple times a day really moves the needle. But let's also talk about some of the dosing protocols as well as some of the mechanisms that we can use to basically offset some of the side effects that we're going to get on growth hormone, because there are going to be a couple. Number one, if you guys are going to do any kind of genetic testing, I highly recommend doing a test for lipoprotein a. While ApoB is the gold standard for overall health when it comes to being on cycle, there can be some interference on a with growth hormone. So making sure that you're not predisposed to having elevated ApoA is a good idea. Next up, I start usually at around 1 IU per week for the first week or two before bumping up to 2 IUs. And then from there, I go as high as I can tolerate, usually spacing things out from a week or two in between. You can start higher if you tolerate it, but typically I've found that slow and steady tends to win the race. If you need to take a day off in between, your body will flush. But what I found is once you start getting the numbness, it starts to tend to compound over time. And at least for me, that's one of the things that limits the overall duration that I was able to tolerate. Also, the higher the edema or the water retention tends to get in your fingers, it can become really difficult to close them. So, for example, you could take things like taurine. Right now I'm taking about 4 grams a day. I have friends that take up to 6 to help mitigate some of the numbness. By the way, you could take taurine 3 grams in the morning, 3 grams at night, or just at night. That's fine. I found personally that keeping carbs lower and keeping my insulin sensitivity made it easier to deal with some of the excess edema. Retatrutide or the GLP-1 is probably my favorite mechanism of doing that. I think Reta, because of what it can do with the glucagon action, makes it vastly superior to tirzepatide, but you can do whatever you want. Metformin, I put on this list, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend running it when GLP-1s exist, is an option that you can use to keep your insulin sensitivity in check. Again, I wouldn't even touch metformin unless you're hitting the pre-diabetic range, but it's just a tool to keep in mind that's available to you. And lastly, nebivolol for resting heart rate, and we're going to touch more on that later. But the short answer is, between the elevated water retention, it seems to have a pretty noticeable impact on resting heart rate for me and a lot of other folks in the community. And nebivolol is a better choice at suppressing that resting heart rate than something like telmisartan, which is really solid for addressing things like blood pressure if it's like slightly elevated. But the impacts on resting heart rate for telmisartan is pretty negligible, whereas for nebivolol, it's pretty noticeable. Propranolol is another option that you can use. It's a shorter acting beta blocker. And also, please check out my last video about how to titrate down from nebivolol as well, if you want to check that out. But regardless, keeping your resting heart rate in check, as well as your blood pressure, is really the 2 main factors that you need as far as preventing any sort of cardiomegaly or LVH or left ventricular hypertrophy growth. With that said, was able to run that pretty flawlessly. I also recommend fasted cardio a lot. Really, any kind of cardio you do is going to help, but the more glycogen storage you're able to burn through, I feel like that helps mitigate the edema more. Obviously, cardio is protective in general, cardiovascularly. It's good for weight loss. It's a good thing to do in general. But I found personally that it tends to help me on the edema and the water retention when I do it fasted than when I don't. But what you guys are really curious about is, how much did I actually grow my hands? Sure, I was able to get up to running 3 1/3, maybe 3.5 IUs, and obviously folks can run as much as 6 to grow their hands. What kind of meaningful difference did I get in terms of the size of my hands? About 25%, to be honest with you. So in this first photo right here, that was me pre-PEDs. I believe I was running L-carnitine and some HCG at the time, but these were very normal climber's fingers that are also dirty for being out in Alabama hills. If you juxtapose that with the second photo, all of a sudden, you can see the difference in width on my fingers and how much noticeably more swollen they are. Also, some of the redness as well from the additional edema. The last photo is about 10% less diameter in finger size and in hand size versus the previous photo. And how do I know? I measured. So this is 3 days after discontinuing growth hormone. I basically lost another little bit. I'll just sort of hold my hands up to the camera a little bit. You can still see that they're definitely thicker than the first photo, where the fingers are much more thin. But I feel like I've lost even a little bit more overall water retention than I did by day 3. So let's talk about it. In the context of off-width crack climbing, if you want your hands as big as possible, there's about a 10% difference between these two. When I did a hand jam, it was the difference of about 9.5 inches to about 9 inches over here. When I did the circumference of my ring finger, this was a full 3 inches, whereas this one was at about 2.7. So pretty noticeable drop in terms of overall volume. You can also see my wedding ring is like struggling for dear life to stay on. When I got to this point in my hand size growth, it takes moisturizer or soap to be able to get it off, as opposed to just being able to take it on and off at will. Even now, after discontinuing the growth hormone, it is I would still probably need, all right, I'm able to get it with a little bit of finesse, but it's still pretty hard to take off my wedding ring, which, I'm sure my wife is absolutely pleased about. Some additional notes that I just want to convey over. I dropped about 3.5 pounds of water weight following the discontinuation of growth hormone. I say over and over and over again that growth hormone is not a peaking compound, it's an off-season compound. If you can drop 3.5 pounds in 3 days doing anything, you'd probably do it. I would love to test it out with hydrochlorothiazide or something like that, which is a diuretic, to see if there's additional water weight I could drop or what the difference in that would look like with GH, but you shouldn't be doing your projects on GH. It just makes no sense. Next up, as far as the numbness, it takes a little bit of time for it to build up, and it takes even longer for it to fully flush. I was able to tolerate the numbness for a while, but my dogs tend to pull when I am walking them, and that's really where I notice the numbness now, being about 2 weeks removed. But other than that, it's mostly gone. Just for context, I'm able to type, sleep, no numbness in the fingers, and even when it's there, it's very, very subtle. When it's at peak and I have trouble closing fingers, that's where it gets kind of annoying. I'm sure a lot of you guys will have climbed for multiple days and climbed really hard for multiple days, and it's kind of hard to close your fingers when you wake up in the morning. That plus the numbness, that feeling sucks. And sometimes when it's really elevated, it can feel like daggers. When I get to that point, that's when I personally like to pull off. Obviously, as long as you can handle your training, you can keep pushing. It's up to you. But for me personally, I found that whenever it starts to get really uncomfortable, it just becomes a quality of life issue, and I don't want to deal with it. Next up, sleep quality was fine dropping growth hormone after the fact. A lot of folks tend to, let me be serious here, the folks that are selling secretagogues are like, oh, you're going to shut down your endogenous growth hormone secretion. Burr, 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 burr. That's bullshit. They're grifters, and they're full of shit. Yes, you will drop your growth hormone output for a couple of days, but it usually returns to being pulsatile in about 2 days, and it takes like a little longer for it to fully catch up. But it's not like testosterone where it takes a really long time to be able to get your growth hormone back to its baseline levels. With testosterone, it could take months to fully get things ramped back up. Start turning on your growth hormone, it happens much, much faster. That's why it's safe enough to give to kids. And going back to the discussion that I had about why I leveraged Nebivolol, as soon as I discontinued the growth hormone, my resting heart rate dropped like a stone. So just to give you a little bit of additional recap, the reason I got on Nebivolol is because my resting heart rate went from in the high 60s, low 70s. When I started growth hormone, it went up to the high 70s, low 80s. And after about a week, I was like, absolutely not. This is dangerous. This is not a thing that I can tolerate. And hopped on Nebivolol. And then I was able to get my resting heart rate back to its baseline. Then, when I dropped the GH but kept the Nebivolol in, my resting heart rate was hanging out at around 60, which is perfect. That is exactly where I want to see it. I'm going to continue to do some cardio to try to push it down to 55. That's my end goal. But even if I decide to get back on GH again, which I probably will after my project, as long as I'm hanging out sub 70 for a resting heart rate, that's okay with me. So now that we've had an opportunity to double check everything, we've gone over a sizable 25% increase in hand size at its peak, kind of capping off at around 15% when all is said and done. Hopefully, if you're interested in some of the size gains from growth hormone or wonder what it can look like from a finger increase in size, you have a better idea. And this was able to be achieved in about 4 months, which is bananas. Next up, I was also able to add about 12 pounds to my block pulls over this 4-month block, which is pretty respectable. I'm obviously not quite at one arm hang yet, but I'm knocking on the door. Or I could always lose some weight and try to get there. I'm walking around at 157 now, and I've pulled about 152 on block pulls. Lastly, I've been really stoked on this process, and I'm ready to gear up for another strength session. But it's also nice to take a break from some of these compounds. I don't know how much I'm going to run GH after I'm able to reach my climbing goals, just because of some of the long-term shortening of the telomeres, and you're sort of, while you do look more youthful and it is better for your skin short-term, you're kind of burning the candle at both ends. So it does have some life-shortening aspects that are fundamentally different than some of the other androgens like testosterone. So I don't know if I'll run growth hormone long-term, maybe in a therapeutic dose at like 1.5 IUs a night. But this is a compound that I definitely feel personally I'm in for a short time and not a long time. But have you used growth hormone? What's your experience? Has it positively helped your recovery? Has it been able to help you out as far as helping you with your finger strength and keeping you more durable, a little bit less injury prone? Is it a thing that you've compounded or stacked with something like BPC 157 in the hopes of increasing your GH expression? We're going to do another video on that soon. If you did, leave your results in the comments down below or let us know in the Discord. We'd love to hear from you. But yeah, with all of that said, I'm Adam with Anabolic Climbing, wishing you good luck, big hands, happy sending, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.